They called the desert their graveyard. We made it ours. The sin got into everything. That was the first thing Walter noticed when they crossed into the Keth expanse. Not the twin suns bleeding orange into the horizon. Not the ridge of black geometry jutting from the dunes like the spine of something buried and long dead. It was the sand. Fine as powdered bone, rust-colored where the light hit it, darker where it didn't, crept into the threading of his jacket, into the corners of his mouth, into the milled grooves of the compass his father had pressed into his palm on the morning he shipped out to a war that should have been the last war. The one after that was supposed to be impossible. Then the Keth came, and the word impossible got retired from the human vocabulary. He checked the compass again. The needle had been drifting for the last 6 kilometers, pulling toward magnetic north and then stuttering left, trembling in small, tight arcs like it was afraid of something nearby. Ellie had noticed it first. She'd been navigating from the back of the crawler, cross-referencing the old survey maps against the atmospheric displacement readings, and she'd gone quiet the way she went quiet before she said something that changed everything. "There's a structure under those dunes," she'd said. "Something big enough to be bending our instruments." She hadn't been wrong yet. 3 years married, 4 years in the field before that, and she had not been wrong yet. Walter drove and said nothing, which was how you told Ellie you agreed with her. The crawler topped the final rise, and they both saw it at once. It wasn't a ruin. That was the first thing to understand. Ruins were crumbled and organic, and they submitted to the land around them. They softened, they rounded, they let the roots in. Whatever jutted from the Keth sand at a 40-degree angle, half-buried and seething with residual heat shimmer, was not submitting to anything. The angles were too deliberate. The materials were too uniform. The sheer scale of the thing defeated the eye. You couldn't get a sense of where it ended because the dune field just absorbed it. And somewhere in the distance, under 200 meters of compacted desert, it was still going. Ellie had her notepad out before the crawler stopped moving. She was already sketching the visible superstructure in broad, quick strokes, the pencil barely lifting, the way she drew when she was excited enough that her hands moved faster than her thoughts. "It's a ship," she said. "You can't know that yet. I know that. Look at the ventral plating geometry, at the hull seam angle. Whatever made this did not grow it from the ground up. They landed it, or crashed it. That's a ship." Walter climbed out of the crawler and stood in the full force of the Keth sun, which was not the sun he'd grown up under, and he looked at the thing in the sand and he felt the hair stand up on his forearms under his jacket. She was right. Of course she was right. They had not been sent here by the Allied Survey Commission to find crashed ships. They had been sent to the Keth expanse to catalog atmospheric anomalies and file a report recommending the sector's suitability for a forward resupply depot. This was the kind of mission given to archaeologists when the military wanted them somewhere without telling them why. Walter had done enough of these postings to know the shape of the deception. The anomalies weren't atmospheric. They never were. He pulled the specimen case from the back of the crawler and followed his wife toward the buried ship. The entry point was low on the exposed hull, a seam that had failed under the pressure of the crash, peeled back enough for a human body to squeeze through sideways. Ellie went first. She always went first. Walter handed her the lamp and followed, scraping through into the dark on his belly, sand pouring in around his collar in a cold, gritty cascade. Inside was different. Inside was cold in a way that had nothing to do with shade. It was the kind of cold that came from sealed spaces, from air that had been still for a very long time and had forgotten how to move. The lamp's beam caught the first corridor, and Walter stood up slowly, brushing sand from his front, and looked. The scale inside was worse than the scale outside. The corridor stretched in both directions for farther than the light could reach, curving gently upward on either end in a way that suggested it was not horizontal at all. The ship was tilted in its burial, and the corridor was following the planet's pull. The ceiling was 4 meters overhead. The walls were ribbed with conduit housings in a pattern that had no equivalent in any human engineering tradition, and the conduits themselves glowed, faintly, a dim pulse of energy that moved through the walls the way a heartbeat moves through a sleeping chest. "Still powered," Ellie said. Her voice was very controlled. After all this time, how long do you think it's been here? She ran her fingers along the hull wall, pressed her palm flat against it, and said nothing for a moment. Then, long enough that the sand above us formed from geological deposition, not from a landslide. Long enough that the atmospheric readings we've been picking up for years are actually leakage from this ship's systems. Long enough that this planet's magnetic anomaly that every survey team has been filing reports about for a decade is. She stopped. Is this, Walter said. Is this? They moved deeper. The interior of the ship was a catalogue of the impossible, made ordinary, through sheer repetition. Chambers the size of hangars, sealed and dark, with rows of objects shrouded under what might have been tarpaulins, or might have been technology performing the same function. Walter couldn't tell without cutting into it, and he wasn't going to cut into anything yet. Corridors that branched and intersected according to a logic he couldn't parse. Some of them opening into vertical shafts that descended into absolute blackness, others terminating in sealed bulkheads engraved with symbols he didn't recognize, but which tugged at something in the back of his memory. Some half-dreamed familiarity he couldn't source. And then the murals. The first one stopped him so completely that Ellie walked 3 reps past him before she realized he wasn't beside her. She turned and found him standing with his lamp held up, his face tipped back, staring. The mural covered the entire wall of a junction chamber, floor to ceiling, wall to wall. A continuous painted record, executed in pigments that were still vivid after what must have been centuries, possibly millennia. It was not abstract. It was representational with an almost clinical precision, a star field rendered in such accurate astronomical detail that Walter, who knew the sky better than he knew most people, could identify several clusters. Set against that star field battle, ships, enormous and angular and brutally practical in their lines, arrayed against each other across distances that the artist had somehow managed to convey. And on one side of that battle, he had to look twice, and then a third time, because the brain rejected what it recognized. On one side of that battle were shapes he had seen before, not in a museum, not in a textbook, in a village market in Morocco, 2 years ago, painted on the side of a water cistern, as a decorative flourish by a craftsman who had told him, when Walter asked where he'd gotten the design from, that his grandfather had gotten it from the old stories and his grandfather's grandfather before that, the same silhouettes, the same proportions. He'd thought it was coincidence then. He didn't think it was coincidence now. Ellie, he said. She came and looked and went very still beside him. Those are, she started. Don't say it yet. Walter, don't say it until we have more data. She looked at him with an expression he had learned to read, which was the expression she wore when she was being patient with him at the expense of being right. Then she turned back to the mural and said nothing, which was how she told him she was right. They moved deeper. It was 40 minutes before they found the room with the artifacts. It was another 20 minutes before Walter admitted to himself what the artifacts were, because the admitting required the abandonment of a framework, of understanding that he had spent his professional life constructing, and the construction materials were not cheap. The object on the central plinth, roughly cylindrical, made of materials he could not identify, machined to tolerances that implied a manufacturing capability that humanity had not yet reached. Fitted with a grip contoured for a hand of roughly human proportion, the object on the central plinth hummed when he picked it up. Passive hum, not the hum of residual power. It hummed in response to his grip, as though it had been waiting, as though something in it recognized something in him, and the recognition woke it. Blade of light extended from one end, pale as the inside of a star, perfectly edged, absolutely silent. Walter stood in the dark of the buried ship and held a weapon made by people who had never stood on Earth. And the weapon recognized him, and he didn't know what to do with that. Ellie took one careful photograph, then took the lamp from his other hand before he dropped it. We need to go, she said. I know, we need to go now. She was not talking about the time. She had that hearing she'd developed in the field, the animal attention to environmental cues that Walter was still training himself to replicate. She'd heard something that he hadn't. He closed his fingers around the grip of the weapon and didn't put it down. Shh. They found the second entrance on the way out, which meant someone else had already found the first one. Safe's people were good. Walter gave them that. They moved quietly, and they had proper equipment, and they'd clearly been tracking the survey readings from Allied Commission transmitters, which meant they had someone inside the commission, which was a problem Walter filed for later. There were 6 of them in the outer corridor, and 2 more outside with the crawler. And Safe himself was standing in the junction chamber under the mural when Walter and Ellie came back through. He was a tall man who wore his authority like a coat in warm weather. Present but unnecessary, a display rather than a function. He was looking up at the mural with an expression Walter recognized from every collector he'd ever crossed swords with. Pure calculation. Is it worth? Who wants it? How do I move it? Dr. Lucas, Safe said without turning around, and Dr. Lucas. A pause that managed to convey that he considered addressing a woman by her professional title a courtesy he was extending, rather than a baseline of human respect. Shh. I wondered when the commission would find this place. I confess I expected more soldiers. We're archaeologists, Walter said. You are, your wife is, and yet you came here knowing I was following your survey signals. Safe finally turned. He was smiling. Either the commission is very confident, or you are very stupid. I've met commission people before. So, the 2 men stood 8 meters apart. Ellie was slightly behind Walter, and to his left, positioned near a conduit housing that she'd identified, he realized, as a cover point. She'd been thinking ahead of him again. What do you want from this ship? Walter said. Everything, Safe said simply. Power systems, the navigational database, the weapons. His eyes moved to the object in Walter's hand. His smile sharpened at the edges. That, especially that, you have no idea what it is. I know what it does. I've seen the other one. He tilted his head slightly. Yes, Dr. Lucas. There was another. My late uncle acquired it 40 years ago in circumstances he never fully explained. A family heirloom, you might say, until he ran into circumstances of his own. The smile again, smooth as oil over sand. I've had many years to understand that there are things in this universe that human beings did not build, and that human beings will sell to each other anyway. Because that is what human beings do. You study it, I monetize it. Different applications of the same fundamentally acquisitive drive. We're not the same. Everyone says that. Safe reached into his coat and produced a sidearm with the casual ease of a man who had done it many times and never been surprised by what happened next. I'll need you both to step away from the central chamber. My people have equipment to move, and you are in the way. Walter felt Ellie's hand very briefly touch the back of his. Pressure. Then gone. He looked at Safe, and he looked at the 6 men in the corridor, and he looked at the weapon in his own hand, which was still humming, and he thought about the mural on the wall and the murals in subsequent chambers. The record of events so vast and so old that human history was a margin note at the bottom. He thought about the 7 billion people on a planet that had just finished one war and was 15 years into recovering from the thing the Keth had done to its eastern cities. He thought about Ellie, who was 3 months pregnant and had not yet told him, though he had known for 6 weeks from the way she moved. Cautious about her body in a way she'd never been before. He thought about the weapon in his hand, which had come awake for him, and not for anyone who'd had 40 years to figure it out. And he thought, there is always a way out. There is always something the other side hasn't accounted for. That was the thing about human beings. You couldn't model the thing they do when you push them hard enough, because they do something new every time. Something they hadn't been able to do before the pressure. Something the pressure itself had made possible. Safe had not accounted for Ellie. That was his first mistake. It was his last one that mattered. She moved the same moment Walter did. He brought the weapon up and forward, and the blade extended to its full length in the dark corridor, and the light of it fell across Safe's face. And for the first time all day, the calculation left his expression. In its place was something Walter hadn't expected. Recognition. The same recognition Walter had felt when the weapon woke in his hand. As though Safe, too, had seen something like this before. Not just in his uncle's heirloom, but in something older. Some memory that didn't belong to him. Ancestral and wordless and afraid. He hesitated 1 second. Ellie moved. She did not hesitate at all. She was through the gap in the left-hand corridor, before the first of Safe's men had turned to track her. And she had the lamp, and she killed it. And the corridor went black except for the faint pulse of the wall conduits, and the cold blade of light in Walter's hand. What followed was not elegant. What followed was 2 minutes of chaos in a very dark space, with Walter putting himself between the entrance to the central chamber and 6 armed men who could not coordinate in the dark and kept colliding with each other and with the geometry of the ship. While somewhere in the adjacent corridors, Ellie was doing things he could hear but not see. A crash, a shout, the sound of heavy equipment toppling. He didn't ask and she didn't explain. That was the agreement. You do your part and trust the other person to do theirs. The 6 men were not soldiers. They were professionals, yes, and they had weapons, and in the light they might have been genuinely dangerous. But in the dark of an alien ship that they had entered 5 minutes ago and did not understand, against a man who had been inside for 2 hours and had learned the geometry of the place the way he learned everything, by moving through it, by putting his hands on it, by paying attention. They were simply people in a dark place where they didn't belong. Walter was not a violent man. He'd been a soldier once briefly, in the last years of the Keth incursion, and he had done what soldiers do, and then he had put that part of himself away as completely as he knew how to. He did not enjoy this, but he was good at it, in the stripped-down pragmatic way, that you became good at things you did enough times for your life to depend on them. And the weapon in his hand did not kill when he used it to deflect and redirect and dissuade. It simply made it very clear that the cost of pressing forward was high, and that the return on investment was going to be poor. They fell back. Not all at once, and not without trying, but they fell back. He found Ellie in the chamber adjacent to the murals. She had her back against the wall, and her hand pressed to her side, and there was a weapon on the floor beside her, and she was breathing carefully. The way she breathed when she was hurt, and not planning to make it anyone else's problem. How bad, Walter said. Not bad, a pause. Not good. Can you walk? I'm going to walk. That was different from yes, but it was sufficient. He got her arm across his shoulders and they moved. The ship was their map now. They knew its rhythms, its corridors, the angle of its buried tilt, the way the conduits dimmed in the sections farther from the power source and brightened near it. They moved toward the entrance and the sound of wind above them, and behind them, Safe was shouting. In a language Walter didn't speak, but whose tone was universal. They made the surface just before the storm front hit. The Keth Expanse did this. Built weather in 30 minutes out of clear air, pulled energy from the superheated sand and the magnetic anomalies, and made a wall of wind and grit that could strip paint. Walter had read about it. He was less prepared for the experience than the reading had suggested. The wall of sand hit them as they cleared the hull opening, and he got his arm across Ellie's face and drove them both forward, into the teeth of it, leaning like they were walking into something solid. Safe's 2 men at the crawler were nowhere. Safe's 2 men had made a decision about their employment contract the moment the storm materialized, and had acted on it with admirable clarity of purpose. Crawler was still there. Walter got Ellie in. He got in behind her. He started it, and drove into the storm without looking back, because looking back in a Keth sandstorm was an excellent way to get turned around and die. And because there was nothing back there he needed to see. He knew what was back there. He would know it the rest of his life. 3 kilometers out, the storm dropped, the way Keth storms did. There one moment, gone the next. The world abruptly clear and orange and vast, the stars beginning to appear in the east where the sky had darkened early. Walter stopped the crawler and checked Ellie's side. The wound was a graze, deep enough to need attention, not deep enough to be immediately dangerous. She submitted to his examination with the particular impatience of someone who had already assessed the situation and moved past it and found the delay in everyone else's processing frustrating. George, she said. Walter looked at her. If it's a boy, she said. I thought George. He didn't say anything for a moment. Then, you could have told me. I know. She looked at the desert. I needed to find this first. He understood that. He wasn't sure he agreed with it, but he understood it, which was most of what marriage was, in his experience. He pressed his forehead against hers for one moment, gently, and then he sat up and started the crawler again. The weapon on the seat between them had gone quiet. Whatever had woken in it had receded to its resting state, patient, waiting, carrying its history through the dark the way the buried ship carried its murals through the centuries. He would have to report it. He would have to report everything. The ship, the murals, the power systems, the fact that someone inside the commission had been feeding survey data to private operators. He would have to report the weapon, which meant the military would take it and study it and misunderstand it, and eventually build something half as effective and twice as dangerous. Because that was what human beings did, with tools they didn't understand and couldn't wait to use. Before all of that, he would take his wife to a doctor. He would eat a meal that wasn't ration bar. He would sleep for approximately 1,000 years. He would do the small human things that kept a person from becoming purely the function they performed in the larger machine of events. They drove east, into the darkening sky, toward the forward base, and the lights and the ordinary world that had no idea what was buried under the sand of the Keth expanse. 7 months later, in a clinic in Geneva, Ellie gave birth to a boy. They named him George. He was a quiet child, attentive in a way that was striking even at 6 weeks. His eyes tracking movement and light with an intentness that the pediatrician called unusual, and his parents recognized as familiar. He would sit for long periods, watching things that other people didn't see. And then he would make a sound that was not quite a word and hold his hands out toward the empty air. And his mother would pick him up and hold him, and his father sit beside them and not say anything. Because there were some things you held close and quiet until you understood them well enough to speak. The commission buried the report. Shades. Not destroyed, that would have required acknowledging that there was a report to destroy. They simply filed it in a category that had no category, assigned it a security classification that required authorizations that didn't officially exist, and allowed it to sleep the way the ship slept, under layers of bureaucratic sediment, patient. Walter went back twice. The first time was 6 weeks after George's birth, on commission orders, with a full survey team and 2 military engineers and a xenolinguist, who spent 3 days inside the ship and emerged with a look on her face that Walter had seen on his own face in every reflective surface since the first day. The team cataloged 17% of the ship's accessible interior before the commission recalled them. The xenolinguist submitted a preliminary translation framework that the commission classified at the same impossible level as everything else. The second time was 3 years later. Alone, in the middle of a night when Ellie was asleep and George was asleep, and the house was quiet in a particular way of houses where the people inside them are content. He drove out to the expanse in a commission vehicle he had no authorization to borrow, let himself back through the original entry point, which was unchanged, and walked to the mural chamber. He stood there for a long time. The murals were not what he'd thought they were the first time. He'd thought they were a record of history, events that had happened, preserved for whoever found them. And they were that. But they were also something else. The xenolinguist's preliminary translation, the fragments Walter had been permitted to see before the classification wall came down, suggested that the murals were not descriptive. They were predictive, the events they recorded, the battles, the alliances, the moments of individual decision that had turned the course of larger things were not entirely in the past. Some of them were in the past. Some of them were ongoing. And some of them, in the xenolinguist's careful academic language, appeared to be instructions. He stood in the lamplight and looked at the battle across the stars and the shapes he'd recognized from a village market in Morocco. And he understood, in the incomplete way that understanding came. When the thing you were understanding was larger than the frameworks available for understanding it, that the universe was old, that the universe had been holding conversations for longer than humanity had been capable of speech, that the thing buried in the sand was not an artifact, it was a message. It had landed here on purpose, or had been guided here on purpose, because here was where the message needed to be. He looked at the central image of the mural. A figure, human in proportion, standing between 2 armies, holding light. He stood there for a while longer. Then he walked back out through the ship, through the entry point, into the desert air that was cold at this hour. and smelled of sand and distance. He drove back to the house. He parked the vehicle. He went inside. George had woken and was standing at the window of his room in the dark, looking at the stars, his breath leaving a fog on the glass. He turned when Walter came in and held his arms up, whoop. And Walter picked him up and held him and looked out the window at the sky. The stars were very old and very patient. Walter held his son and said nothing. There was nothing useful to say. There was only the ordinary miracle of a small person alive in his arms, warm against his chest, looking at the universe with eyes that saw something Walter couldn't name yet. There was only the knowledge, carried now like the ship carried its murals, that the conversation was not over. See, that it had barely started. That somewhere in the long argument between what human beings were and what the universe required of them, there was an answer taking shape. He didn't know the shape of it yet. He thought George might. 3 years after Walter's second visit, the Commission's classified report found its way into the wrong hands. Not through negligence, through the deliberate action of someone inside the Commission who had decided that certain things were too important to be owned by institutions. The file arrived anonymously on the desks of 12 journalists, 6 independent scientists, and 1 retired military commander who had spent 20 years asking questions. The Commission had declined to answer. The Commission's response was swift and comprehensive and almost entirely ineffective. The story got out anyway. Important things always got out. In pieces, through the gaps, carried by individuals who had decided that silence was a form of complicity they were no longer willing to maintain. The buried ship became the thing everyone was arguing about for 6 months, and then the thing everyone had an opinion about, and then the thing everyone referenced, and then, inevitably, in the way of things that are true, the thing that simply was incorporated into the public understanding of the world as a new given, a new fixed point around which other understandings reorganized themselves. We were not alone. We had never been alone. The universe had been attended since long before we arrived in it, and the things that had attended it had left records in the sand and stories in the circuits of sleeping ships and images on the walls of buried chambers. Walter gave one interview. A journalist who had been a student of Ellie's before the Commission absorbed her research, and who had known Walter for long enough to ask the right question at the end of a long, careful conversation. "What do you think it means?" the journalist asked. "All of it. The ship, the murals. Do you think it means for us?" Walter thought about the weapon in his hand and the way it had woken. He thought about the murals and the xenolinguist's word. Instructions. He thought about Ellie in the dark of the alien corridor, moving without hesitation, doing what needed doing. Not because she had a plan, but because she was paying attention, and attention was enough. He thought about George at the window, looking at the stars. "I think it means we were expected," he said. The journalist waited. Someone buried that ship. Someone made those murals. Someone built a weapon that knows when a human being picks it up. He paused. He was not comfortable with this part. He had been not comfortable with it for 3 years. And the discomfort had not diminished. They left us a record of everything that came before. Everything that mattered. Every battle and decision and moment where something turned on, whether one person held or walked away. He looked at his hands. They wanted someone to find it. They wanted someone to read it. And then they wanted that someone to understand that the argument isn't over, and that there's a part for us to play in it. "What part?" "I don't know yet," Walter said. "It's ours, and we're the only ones who can play it." That evening he drove back to the expanse alone. He stood at the hull of the ship, where it jutted from the sand, black against the stars, and he felt the scale of it the way he had the first day. The weight of time and distance and implication pressing down on him. The vertigo of standing at the edge of a thing too large to see whole. Then he put his hand on the hull, and the ship pulsed once, slow and deep like a sleeping chest. And somewhere inside it, in the dark among the murals and the records and the instructions, a light came on. It wasn't much. A single point of illumination in the farthest chamber, barely visible through the stripped hull seam, so faint it could have been instrument error or imagination. But it was there. It was there the way a lamp is there in a window, in a house in a dark field. Not dramatic, not announcing itself. Just present, like a fact that had been waiting to become available, like an answer forming in the long silence between a question and the mind that would finally ask it. Walter stood in the desert under the old stars and breathed the cold air that smelled of sand and distance, and the weight on his chest was not gone. It would never be entirely gone, but underneath it, steady and durable as the compressed geological record that had hidden the ship for centuries, was something else. It felt unmistakably like a beginning,